皆様本日はお忙しい中、ブロックチェーングローバルガバナンスカンファレンス、フィンサムブロックチェーン&ビジネスご参加をいただきまして誠にありがとうございます。では、お時間となりましたので、これよりブロックチェーン人材の育成と新時代の開花、持続可能なブロックチェーンコミュニティ形成に向けてをテーマにパネルディスカッションを始めてまいります。では本日ご出演の皆様方、リモートからのご参加になりますパネリストの皆様からご紹介を申し上げます。東京大学教授松浦寛太様、よろしくお願いいたします。
よろしくお願いいたします。
DLT エデュケーションプレジデント B セーフネットワークエヴァンジェリストロバート・シュベンツカー様、Mr. シュベンツカー please。続いて、イーサリアムファウンデーションエグゼクティブディレクター、宮口彩様。よろしくお願いいたします。そして本セッションのモデレーターをお務めをいただきますのは、ケンブリッジ大学オルタナティブ金融センターディレクター、ロバート・ワードロップ様でございます。では、始めてまいりましょう。Dr. Watlop, if you'd please start your session.
Great. Well,Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you might be. It happens to be early morning for me. I think it's afternoon in Tokyo. And I think our panelists, it's evening for some of them. So we have a global audience, a very interesting discussion today. And I would like to thank the organizers, first of all, for inviting such an eclectic panel that brings very different perspective to this topic.We have three individuals who will be joining us. They'll be introducing themselves in just a moment in more detail, and in particular talking a little bit about how they engage with talent in the blockchain and DLT community. It was briefly mentioned, my Japanese is limited to say the least, that I am the director of the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance at the University of Cambridge, and I'm a faculty member on the business school. But my background,I'm an economic sociologist, so issues around trust and structures and communities are of great interest to me. Also, I'm the director and developed a program specifically to train regulators around the world on technology issues impacting the development of regulation. And we have an 8-week course, which I lead, called FinTech and Regulatory Innovation. And blockchain and DLT,is a very important element within that course, and consistently, cohort after cohort, comes up as an area of great interest that regulators are seeking to understand more greatly. So I'm very interested in this discussion today. I'd like to pass it over to our panel to introduce themselves, starting with Aya, please.
Hi, thank you, Robert. My name is Aya Miyaguchi. I am Executive Director of the Ethereum Foundation.The Ethereum Foundation does everything related to the Ethereum community, from facilitating and coordinating all the development and research work, and basically everything related to the technology of Ethereum, but also that the community growth of the Ethereum, open source Ethereum community. I also sit as a global counsel for the World Economic Forum now.And I'm also a board member of Ethereum Enterprise Alliance. Before joining the EF, I have been in the industry since officially 2013. So I've been in this space for a while. For this space, it's long. And I was involved in the development of the industry.This crypto or blockchain industry in Japan too. I'm currently based in San Francisco, although I travel most of the time. So it's pretty late now for me.
Yeah.
I hope my brain stays functioning. But thank you for having me.
Very good. Robert.
Thank you, Robert, and to the organizers as well. Good morning.I have worked with developers and technologists for much of my career, mainly as an educator, but also as a developer and a system administrator. I ran developer relations for American Express, as well as PayPal, while at PayPal, I realized programmable money was a very important development, and began to experiment with all things blockchain and cryptocurrencies. From there, I created Blockchain University, which existed only for about a year. But in that time, we educated dozens of people, hundreds of people. We took teams to India, to Japan, gave conferences, led hackathons, and developer types of experiences. From there, I'm now running BLT Education, which has run a number of blockchain types of hackathons globally and provided educational sessions at universities and conferences and such. I've also been involved with a project with the United Nations Women Project to experiment with blockchain technologies for cash transfer and identity. And more recently have co-organized a hackathon online to test out the Facebook Libra platform. Thank you.
Great. Kanta, please.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to join this session. And I'm an information security professor at the University of Tokyo. And the project in my lab include fundamental cryptography, network and computer security, and the economics of information security. Among the projects, use of proof of work for anti-denial of service attacks and security tokens and their derivatives published in 2001, and the completely digital secure timestamps in 2004. Those projects are quite largely related to blockchain. And I think graduate students' experiences in such pioneering projects could be a good baseline of talent development in this research community and the academia of blockchain. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we have a very eclectic group. I noticed the backgrounds are really quite different when I looked at everyone's bios. You would have heard a lot of discussion actually about technology, but I know that Robert's background really comes from dramatic arts and fine arts, perhaps a long time ago, and sort of liberal arts coming to technology, whereas Kanta, you've really been deeply involved in the technology the whole way through. Hence, I think some very interesting and different perspectives on the topic today. And we're all involved, obviously, in talent development. And I, some of the themes I think that are important to try and bring out today include, what is it about the community that makes, talent development particularly challenging? I mean, it's a young community, and that introduces some issues. And perhaps, Aya, if you could talk a little bit about your perspective on what makes the community at this point introduces some challenges in terms of talent development.
Yes. So the community is really growing very quick. And now we have enterprise players that we did not have originally because of the challenges that the technology itself had. With that growth, I see probably the biggest gap I see is the original members that, specifically to the Ethereum community, it is an open source project. So they were volunteers or contributors that individual teams and developers who were pretty, they were geeks, pretty nerdy about that, learning, discovering something that's not easy to discover. And now this is growing, and then new businesses are looking into building something on this technology. And then I see a biggest gap between maybe super nerdy level of engineers and also the higher level decision makers of businesses or organizations or institutions or governments that could make decisions to be benefited by the technology. So that's where I see the gap, and then that's still a challenge regarding the talent acquisition or talent development. And now we see, like this year, I saw that the best, I think the most needed skill set that LinkedIn posted was one of them was Solidity, which is like language of the Ethereum platform. And then there are a lot of developers who are learning about that. But how do we kind of fill the gap between them and the higher level decision makers? I think that
issue of diversity is interesting because, of course, it's what can produce real innovation. But, of course, diversity is on a spectrum. If it becomes sort of too broad, you don't get enough cohesion in terms of everyone sort of being sufficiently aligned for productive outcomes. And Robert, I know you have some views on this, particularly with respect to, closed, open, different sort of communities that may have different views or approaches with respect to approaching the technology and outcomes. Can you talk a bit to that?
There's clearly a distinction between open public types of blockchains like Ethereum and more enterprise, what we may call enterprise blockchains that are built upon technologies such as the Hyperledger projects. So when one develops talent for each of these types of systems, that sort of enterprise, private types of blockchains as opposed to public, there's distinct difference. There's differences in the approach and how what are the required skills for those types of platforms. Specifically, please go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Robert, please.
So, I think in the case of the public blockchains, the types of people that are approaching these types of systems are mostly interested in startup communities. They're interested in joining a startup or founding a startup, whereas in the enterprise scenarios, it's often people who are already working at those companies. And so the approach to learning is different. They're likely more structured types of trainings for the enterprise types of blockchain platforms. A lot of learning is done in a hackathon formats for the public types of systems. And so the challenges are how to develop content for these different types of systems and such. And there's a question of should this training content be open source itself? I'll pause right there.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, Robert, you had also, I think, raised the issue when we were certainly talking in our prep call about the issue of certification emerging and almost standards of talent development. And I know, Kanta, you're specific, quite deeply involved in your environment in skill development. What are your thoughts regarding some of these issues around credentialization? Because you're in the formal world to some degree, right? You've got formal credentialization in terms of degree granting, as we would call it in academia. How does that interface with non-degree granting, certification, and some of the gaps that you're seeing?
Yes, actually, I mostly agree to the views regarding the gaps and diversity problems already mentioned in the other two guys. And I think we need to develop a very good DLT and blockchain system with knowing that there were such gaps at present. And in many cases, the developers may just keep something unnecessary when they are trying to do some incremental advance of their implementations just for insurance. And as a result, the systems may be getting too heavy, and that could happen that a completely different style of the development in the case that they are very, very too optimistic regarding the skipping of something for security purposes. In that case, the resultant systems might be too weak in some sense. So the community gaps may provide either too heavy systems or too weak systems. And as a result, if we take a wrong direction, the resultant systems will be far from being environmentally friendly, meaning that we are just putting a lot of things which are unnecessary. And I think such scenario is not really good for society. And I think if we consider such, the social benefits, we need to solve the, wide variety of gaps. Thank you.
Okay, this is an interesting point. We're going to follow that one up, I think, in a couple of the other themes we're going to be addressing. I'm going to move now into, I think, a discussion. If we did not discuss this in this panel, we would be remiss, which is clearly the impact of COVID, right? This is changing every industry, every community. Aya, could you talk about how your view of maybe where some challenges have emerged, but also, always when that's a challenging environment, innovation to some extent emerges. And maybe you could talk a little bit to that.
So regarding the impact from the COVID situation, I was actually asked at the World Economic Forum meeting that what are you differently for the COVID situation? And this has been a topic like everywhere I join, whether it's United Nations Secretary General conversations. My answer is that interestingly, we do what we have been doing because to some extent, the attention to this technology is bigger, and also the world is recognizing the importance of giving transparency, giving security, giving privacy in a better way. And this blockchain technology, like we've been working on this for those purposes. There are reasons why we think that decentralized system is needed, and that we do everything to solve issues, like real world issues in the world. It's not just to say we are building something on blockchain. So in a way, it is an opportunity for us to educate people and inspire people for why this technology is important, this is needed. And it's also, we actually are receiving more demand to provide that level of information. So for my work and for our work, I know, a lot of people are in the world are struggling to cope with the situation, and we do have the same thing on a personal level, in our personal life. But regarding our work, we actually have more things to do, and so I see this in a way an opportunity to kind of provide better education.
And Robert, I think, you've had a lot of experience both with in situ, right, face-to-face. That's clearly experiential, that social engagement is very important in talent development in this particular community. It's largely migrated online. What are the challenges that you see introduced by that kind of shift in engagement context, if you will?
Certainly the ability to interact with people in person is completely lost in this new era of COVID for months likely now. And this does, though, perhaps open up a new opportunity to begin to create education that is more multi-stakeholder focused, so that if we do an online course, say for developers, or an in-person class for developers, of course, developers are there. Usually you wouldn't find, say, regulators in those types of courses, or business people perhaps, less so. But imagine now that we can have a more neutral kind of approach to the education that will potentially welcome multi-stakeholders to convene to sort through the many complex types of problems faced by blockchain technologies. So while we do have the challenge of not meeting in person, perhaps this is a new opportunity to bring people together from different backgrounds to learn together online in this new world of COVID.
So that's interesting. Do you think that bringing in those sort of other stakeholders that would not be sort of participants in a traditional hackathon environment, that it's just less intimidating? What's going on there? Do you have any speculation as to why that is actually easier?
Online as opposed to...
Yeah.
I think it's less intimidating because you're not in the same room with those other types of people. It's not frequent that you find developers, say, meeting up with regulators and such. We've heard some feedback in our multi-stakeholder workshops that we've been doing with BSafe Network that developers are often very reluctant to even approach regulators. And imagine there may be opportunities now for there to be cross-pollination of ideas and such as developers and entrepreneurs begin to build out systems and to innovate new ideas and systems to bring together these disparate groups.
Well, it's interesting. I would agree. Also, I have experience on the regulator side, and there is a natural wariness, shall we say, about that engagement in a human contact environment that I think is intermediated in a very interesting way as soon as everyone is on an electronic platform. You get to kind of control your engagement, perhaps, with a little bit more precision. So I agree with your view, but Kanta, you're also, I think, very sensitive to some of the opportunities that have emerged during the COVID period. Again, perhaps bringing different groups together, accommodating that diversity, but broader engagement but still alignment. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yes, I'm experiencing, of course, both challenges and opportunities under this COVID situation. And actually, another Robert mentioned that the BSafe network, and my lab is operating one of the BSafe network nodes. But unfortunately, the node was temporarily suspended due to the policy network security policy issues of our campus, which is uncontrollable by a single laboratory, and that's a very, very tiny issue, but can be very big if we accumulate such phenomena all over the world to consider the big systems. And also in my research interests, I'm pretty much emphasize the economics of information security, and I also experienced the cancellations of the projects regarding the use of blockchain for agriculture, where we need to consider the economic empirical studies, which is very, very important in the research community. And this can be an annoyance in our field, but currently the people are considering very individual, solutions part by part. But at present, I'm afraid that there's not that much as very, single, very big trend of how to overcome this situation. But as opposed to such challenges, we are also finding some of the big future research issues regarding the use of DLT or blockchain for our societies. For instance, if DLT-based loyalty programs, such as point systems, mileage, etc., are available for sharing a solution of implementing very, very complicated economic policies and measures. For instance, I think Japanese people are quite aware of what we call go-to campaign of Japan under this situation. And in implementing such policies, the solution can be much more efficient and sophisticated if we can develop a good systems by using blockchain. So I think the COVID situations are so suggestive for our new challenges as well. So I would like to look at such, say, challenging but positive side of the things. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and you had mentioned a little bit along the same lines that what COVID to some extent has done is it sort of, elevated, how the community can address some of the almost existential problems is probably a bit too strong, but in that direction, you're in a kind of a nonprofit environment that gives you a voice that's a little bit different in terms of how you can speak and what you can say in terms of engaging parties in the community. Could you talk a little bit about the developing world? Because clearly, you're involved with certainly, the UN and different projects. You've talked about the importance of inspiration and the resonance of big problems, real problems that really engage people. But the community itself is a technology community. It tends to communicate, it tends to be in some ways structurally isolated a little bit from the people who actually are rather critical to engage for this to have global impact. Can you talk about that a little bit? You're well positioned, I think, to have a view on that issue.
Sure, thank you. This is I am most passionate about this topic, so I appreciate you bringing this up. So looking at our existing community, I always challenge the community members that are we defining our community as like the community on Twitter, which is if you just assume everyone on Twitter is everything that we see in the community that's very limited. And for those people who are actually have most problems that can be solved by this technology, this is not just a fancy thing. This is real. And for them, I hate actually to use the term social impact, because it's kind of, for them, it's not even social. This is like real solution they need to provide to like daily issues that they have. For example, related to the COVID, we work with the UNICEF innovation team, and then they fund blockchain startups in emerging markets that are providing real solutions to real world problems. When we say real, it's like their local thing. A problem such as having to verify the police you're talking to if they're real police or not. We never understand that. Like just looking at the things from the Twitter. I mean, I'm not trying to ditch Twitter, but just like we need to really understand they're trying to solve real issues. And then actually one of the themes is a lot of things are actually happening in Latin America. I'm very impressed because their culture is really, they accept experiments as like at least one solution that's better than the current situation. They might make some mistakes, but it's moving forward instead of like being stuck at the current situation. So things like providing transparency for how the subsidies are being used, how this is going, or procurement system that is normally have a lot of corruption in the process. There is a blockchain solution that the World Economic Forum did a case study in Colombia working. It's kind of hybrid Hyperledger and Ethereum, but something like that, like we can also learn a lot from looking at that, because it's really not just a fancy thing to look at. It's more like a real solution that they can look at what do not work with their local situation and have to work with local developers. And with that, I think it's really important for us to reach those who, like, I call it the next billion, and they're the one who is going to actually be the user. And like if you know anything about business, like that's the next generation, next region that you need to look at. Like even you only care about the business opportunities. I hope that explains.
Well, that's great. And I'm going to actually present that as a bit of a challenge to both Robert and Kanta, because they're both experienced, right? And what you've done is you've talked, I think, about how do you get to what is really identification of the real problems? Because those aren't even necessarily being revealed. But then once those are revealed, that engagement has to happen. You mentioned local developers. Robert, you've talked about sort of that gap. You spoke earlier about, sort of, or I did, but you'd referred to it as well. There's a middle role here, almost a translator role between people who bridge between kind of hackers and, let's call it, the decision makers, to use some pejorative terms. But also, I think even in terms of the developing world, you've got sort of local people, very embedded locally, and you may have sophisticated, skill-capable people who may not necessarily. How do you bridge that? I mean, you've been in this education game in the community for a long time. How would you solve that problem? There's a bit of a curveball.
Very interesting question. I think this is not just a blockchain issue, if you will, right? There's certainly typically many technologies that would be used to create a solution for any given situation. If we're thinking of the so-called social impact type of situations or financial inclusions, things of that nature, the developers are certainly tasked with doing some types of things that are sophisticated technically. However, they must have understandings of the reality of what's going on the ground, whether solutions they are proposing and creating are practical or not, whether or not they are useful for the end users. Very important. So there's certainly an aspect of blockchain there, but I think there's sort of greater technical issues around developing solutions that are practical for any sorts of people. I hope that sheds some light.
So it's interesting. It does, and I'm going to go to Kanta because he's not going to get off the hook because this is a tricky question. But I will say that in my research center, what we had to do, we realized actually a bit to Aya's point, we actually had to put people on the ground. We've got 4 people in sub-Saharan Africa now that are based in Nairobi. We're putting 3 into the MENA region, and we're about to put 3 in Q4 into Asia-Pac. And the challenge we found is that you can float, when you're kind of in the world of technology and digital communications, somehow you're sort of floating above a lot that's going on the ground that's very visceral and very real. And you have a challenge of how do you actually really, really engage with that and cross-cut knowledge pools that can bring solutions to the table. So what we found is there are a lot of what we call knowledge clusters producing knowledge that have skills, that have ability, but there's a lack of connectedness. And I think what Aya was referring to is sort of in a hierarchical sense, what's not being connected. Kanta, you have a group of individuals and a research competence at a very high skill level with some very deep expertise. How could you cross connect into some of these other pockets where there's deep need? Or are you connecting with them today? I suspect perhaps not as well as you potentially could or the need demands. Do you have some thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you very much for very, very, striking questions. And but I would like to switch into my operational mode of more, on educators rather than researchers, and to provide or to suggest a solution for a particular problem is one thing, and my continual efforts for solving the talent development problems in this emerging field need to be some more generalized views or strategies, I think. And my strategies include my best effort for providing a very wide spectrum of opportunities for those who are engaged, for those who are facing such problems. So then after that, maybe they would suggest much better solution than I might think of. And I can mention 2 examples today, what I'm experiencing in recent years. First, I need to again mention the BSafe network. The Anna Robert is doing a lot of work. The involvement into such network projects include a multi-stakeholder discussion to meet different people. Okay. So doing that inside the lab and outside the lab, that is quite important. My students can experience a lot without clearly being involved with a particular, say, internship and so on. And also another point is how to solve the generation gaps, okay? So I actually am a founding member of Base Alliance, which is consortium-style activities in the blockchain domain. And actually, our alliance launched an award called a Base Alliance Youth Award, where young students, including high school students and junior high school students, can apply by writing a short essay in the domain of blockchain. And diversity of generations would be a very, very important aspect in considering the long-lasting our social baseline to support or to enhance the efforts of finding new solutions. And sorry for providing a very, very general views to a very particular question, Robert.
That's okay. Look, I think one of the most interesting sort of mechanisms that is to technical communities generally, but certainly to this one is sort of the use of hackathons, ideathons, and they play an important role. I think I'd like to talk about that a little bit. And you mentioned inspiration earlier. These hackers, mentors, things. But there's other things that I think the contribution to the community of the sort of the hackathon platform or environment around, giving visibility on challenges and technical. Could you talk to that a little bit? Because I'd like to explore where can hackathons and ideathons maybe go from here?
Yes, so there are many hackathons. Also, there are actually hackathons specifically targeting to provide solutions to the COVID-related problems. With blockchain, I've seen that. I've actually joined as a judge too. And some of the hackathons that we actually specifically fund are if you go to a hackathon, of course, there are hackers, developers work together to work on a project. The hackathon that we normally support, it's 3-day weekend thing, but it has become they are experimenting 1 month hackathon because it's all online, and you can kind of participate and then kind of work together aside, as a side job. But at the same time, they do have mentors from experts from the community or the Ethereum Foundation. They mentor new beginner hackers there to learn how to build things on Ethereum. And also mentor sides, they also are benefited by looking at challenges that these developers are having to build things on Ethereum, like what can be improved regarding developer experience, DevX, or usability of Ethereum, and then things like that, or even scaling and privacy and everything. But it's important for them to actually see that in front of their eyes, and here are the challenges that they would, regular new people, who join the community would face. And that's how, and then there are also sponsors, can be businesses. They give bounties. And here are challenges that we want everyone to think about that can benefit our product. So that way they support community. They support hackers by giving bounties, but also hackers support business side to come up with the idea. So these are kind of like I see this interactive benefit to each side, which I think is growing, and I think it's being done pretty well.
So the challenging question over to you to build on that, Robert, would be, I know that one of your views is there's a serious gap in knowledge about governance and the importance of governance. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how could that be integrated into the hackathon form, which is really quite experiential? And how would you thread in this governance awareness, knowledge, importance into that in terms of education and training?
Good question. The complexity of governance flows in many levels in any given platform. There's people who are writing the code, the people who are implementing the code, the people who are using the output of the code and such. The challenge of getting an entire community to understand governance in the hackathon format, I think, would really require some education sessions tied into within the hackathon. So imagine there's types of sessions that are developed not only for developers but other stakeholders to provide some educational context, and then imagine a hackathon that's curated in such a way where you have teams of people working together from different backgrounds, representing, say, businesses and or policy makers and or developers and such. So bringing them together to understand and explore possibilities around governance, I think, is a way forward. There are, as you know, so many different types of blockchain systems and governance approaches, and finding a way to pick elements of the governance that's relevant to, say, in a context of a hackathon is a tricky and challenge. So I think a challenge will have to be developed to kind of understand that, imagine that this particular system is developed and rolled out, and who are those stakeholders? What is this platform serving? What is its purpose? So creating education that will explore governance relative to an imagined system over a period of time, and then develop ideas and projects and outcomes for such a structure, if that makes sense.
Well, I know that when we were talking about this earlier, you had mentioned perhaps we could talk about governance in context and in a historical context. And I'm thinking, well, yes, we could talk about governance going back to the early stages of the Industrial Revolution and bring models and how that's evolved over time. And in fact, you clarified that you were talking about going back to 2017. So that's a good illustration of just how young the community is. And I think we're going to end on that note because, of course, that's an opportunity and a challenge, right? Unbounded too much a community by history, but at the same time feeling its way along a little bit in terms of some of the issues we've talked about. And our time is up, and as a result, we'll close here. I want to thank the panel for a great contribution. And I personally have looked forward to meeting all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
We thank you very much for your participation in this session. And ladies and gentlemen, please send a big round of applause. Thank you so much. This concludes the session. これをもちまして、ブロックチェーン人材の育成と新時代の開花、持続可能なブロックチェーンコミュニティ形成に向けてパネルディスカッションは終了とさせていただきます。 続いてのセッションのご案内でございます。この後は16時20分よりホール A にてパネルディスカッションデジタル決済 STO の未来、そしてこちらのホール B でもパネルディスカッションブロックチェーンと新しい移動経済と題してお届けをしてまいります。オンライン視聴の皆様、ご視聴いただくセッション会場の URL をご選択の上ご視聴お願いいたします。では次のセッション開始時間16時20分まで今しばらくお待ちください。